Fighting is the sort of ultimate act of solidarity with someone else. You can send all the love and best wishes in the world, or you could actually go and live by your ideals and support people on the ground that need your help. Zelensky did a bold thing by calling for international volunteers to join a so-called Ukrainian Legion. The Russian line collapsed and we were able to take back Kherson.
How much sort of personal peril or danger were you in at the time? Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spikes. I'm delighted to be joined in conversation with Macer Gifford. Welcome.
It's good to be here.
Macer, you have been on the Ukrainian front line. You're something of a serial international volunteer, which we'll come on to soon. Tell us, first of all, you've been in Ukraine essentially since before the war started, am I right in thinking?
That's correct.
Yeah, so tell us about, first of all, those early days and then how you ended up on the front line.
I suppose in the early days of the conflict, I actually went out 2 weeks before the war started, primarily because I was motivated by the huge amount of press that we were all getting. The CIA and MI6 released information and data that the Russians were mobilizing on the border, war was imminent, and to see where I could assist or help local defenders, I decided to go out and perhaps start a medical program and to engage with some of my friends who were already deployed out there. In the end, it didn't necessarily work out because of the scope of the invasion, the size of it. I mean, when I first arrived, I had a Ukrainian member of parliament say to me that he didn't even believe the war was going to happen. And that was 24 hours prior to the invasion. So I went out as largely a reconnaissance trip. And then I came back with a huge amount of medical supplies for several months, got to know people on the ground before finally joining the army in September of 2022.
And tell us a bit about what the kind of things you saw out there. I mean, a lot of people have described the Ukraine war as almost 21st century trench warfare, but with drones. I mean, what is the reality like on the front line?
Well, it very much is that. It's a conventional war, the largest in Europe since the Second World War. There are two vast armies with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, with thousands of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, just having at each other. So the front line, it depends where the front line is over 1,000 miles long.
Yeah.
So it really depends where you're operating, depends the level of the seriousness of the fighting, etc. My initial area of operations was actually in the south. So I took part in the liberation of Kherson at the end of 2022. That was prior to that, it was all fighting in vast open fields. Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe and of the world, really.
Yeah.
And we were doing reconnaissance missions down the tree lines, clearing mines, locating enemy positions and calling in artillery. That eventually the Russian line collapsed and we were able to take back Kherson, a major city in the south. And then it entered for me personally a new phase where I was fighting on the sort of Dnipro Delta, where we were pushing out on boats, seizing ground, taking back islands, and engaging with sort of fights in a very sort of limited geographical area we were effectively light infantry against light infantry. So it was a very different battle, for example, than say Bakhmut, which was a grinding war of attrition. And then when the proliferation of drones became too difficult for us to operate on the islands, my team was able to reform, go for retraining, invest in additional equipment. And we actually also became an FPV team where we targeted Russian assets utilizing commercial drones. And we did that for a number of months. I mean, I fought not only in the south, but then when the offensive and the summer offensive from the Ukrainians pettered out, we actually were called up to go to a place called Liman in the Far East, where the Russians began counterattacking just before, let's say, Christmas of 2023. And it was in Liman that I sort of finished my service and returned home.
And how much sort of personal peril or danger were you in at the time?
Horrendous. It's a very different environment to say the time that I spent fighting in Syria, a very different war. The Russians have lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The Ukrainians also have lost 100,000+ troops. And just on the ground, it was just it depended where you were and the time of the year. The armies, both armies, tended to move more in the summer months, and there was a limited time in the winter when things became a little bit calmer. Also, the severity of the war also depended on the timing, because Russia was hit so badly at the beginning of the war, in the first few months of the conflict, that a lot of their elite troops and a lot of their best equipment was actually decimated and destroyed. And it took a long time for them to reform, to bring new people in. And that was reflected on the ground. So when I was in the south in Kherson, we were pushing forward through tree lines. We were attacking a number of different positions in different ways. And then it was after the collapse of the Kherson front, and they retreated back to more secure positions, then things got more nasty, and the conflict just intensified, I suppose you could say.
And there's a lot of people in the West who, I think it's fair to say, are getting a slightly skewed view of the war. You'll hear that really, it's being puppeteered by the Americans fighting to the last Ukrainian, or perhaps it's Zelensky that's prolonging the war to enrich himself and his cronies, or that kind of thing. You've been there. You've seen what is really going on, what is really motivating people. Does that bear any resemblance to reality?
None at all. And I'll tell you why. Because this is just a naked act of aggression. Vladimir Putin has made his aims for Russia and the so-called greater Russia that he envisions very clear. And he's done that for a very long time. He described sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union as one of the world's greatest tragedies. We know the sort of man Vladimir Putin is. He's a populist leader. He's someone who created a system within Russia, an oligarch-based autocracy that uses they call it their near abroad. It sort of manipulates and erodes any form of democratic or basic freedoms in the countries around them, which they genuinely consider part of a greater Russia. Ukraine is a major part of that ambition. The Ukrainian people are an entirely separate people from Russia. They've got their own literature, language, history, culture, everything. I mean, Kyiv as a city and as a country and as a culture is actually older than Russia. It pre-exists the Russian state and everything else. So this is, as I said, a naked act of imperial aggression. Zelensky is a democratically elected leader. He won on a mandate of peace in the Donbass and of closer relationship with the EU. But he had his hands forced with the Russian invasion. And I feel great empathy with the Ukrainian people, because at the end of the day, this is not the Americans or the British forcing the Ukrainians to fight. You can't force hundreds of thousands, millions of people to resist an invasion. This has to be sort of from the country, from the will of the people. And that's what you see on the ground in Ukraine. Zelensky remains a very popular figure in Ukraine.
Yeah, I was going to say, have you noticed a difference in how Ukrainians see themselves almost since the war began? Because you were, as you said, you were there before it all kicked off.
They're certainly more united in the sense that, so Ukraine, to truly understand the Ukrainian conflicts, you really have to understand Ukrainian history, Russian history, and the politics over the last 20 years. But just to quickly summarize, obviously, Ukraine is a diverse country. There is a very large Russian minority within the country, and that was reflected for many years within the politics of the country. And then there was, and because of Russian sort of hybrid warfare and their desire to control and manipulate the sort of democratic processes of Ukraine. I think that's, if you want to have a more recent example, look no further than Moldova and and Armenia, and Georgia, I should say. But in Ukraine, the Russians have sort of manipulated Ukraine for a very, very long time. And there was division within Ukraine about which direction it should take, whether it was more towards the European Union or more towards Russia. What I've noticed is that there is a lot more Russian speakers people who are ethnically Russian identifying with Ukraine and supporting the Ukrainian cause. There is still, if you look at the polls, people still wish to continue fighting. There is many different sort of opinions on what that fighting will look like and what the ultimate peace might look like. But one thing I would urge people to do is not fall for this sort of continuous sort of Russian line that this is some sort of an American proxy war, and that Ukraine doesn't exist and has never existed. It's actually part of Russia. It's utterly absurd. And there's wonderful books out there that I would 100% recommend.
Now, before we move on to talk about Syria, I just want to address the viewers and listeners at home. Please, please, please give generously to this year's Spiked Christmas Give-a-thon. Now, I know that Spiked is free. We don't ask you for any money to view our articles, watch our videos or podcasts, but we do obviously need your money to keep us alive. And it is through your donations primarily that Spiked is able to do what we do. 70% comes from donations from audience members like yours, not from big bucks from advertising. We don't have huge sponsors as much as we'd like them. If you appreciate any of what we do, whether it's campaigning for free speech around democracy, whether it's been the recent coverage of assisted dying, then please dig deep for us this Christmas. And why not get yourself a Spiked mug? If you give £50 or more, you can get your hands on one of these beauties. Unfortunately, the offer's only for UK donors, but please give generously regardless of where you are in the world. To find out more about donating, to find out more about the offer, to find out more about why you should give so generously to Spiked this Christmas, just go to spiked-online.com/donate. That's spiked-online.com/donate. Whether it's for the mug, without the mug, please give generously to our Christmas Give-a-thon. Thank you. And I want to talk to you briefly about Syria, because you fought with the Kurds against ISIS in Syria, which, it's an incredibly brave thing to do. And am I right in saying you basically left the city of London to go and join up in the fight against ISIS?
Pretty much. I mean, I was working in business development at the time, working for a sort of a boutique foreign exchange company. But my background, both my degree and my master's, is in the field of international relations. My passion is there. After university, I worked for a number of different sort of charities and political organizations. Most obviously, in sort of 2008, I should say, I was working in Zimbabwe for the Movement for Democratic Change. I've worked for the British Conservative Party in the past. And for me, when the Islamic State rose up and began butchering people and selling women in cages, burning them in cages in the streets of Raqqa and Mosul, I saw it as an ideological battle, as far as I was concerned. This was a genocidal death cult that wanted to roll back the clock in the Middle East and destroy its diversity. And in regards to the local forces that were resisting, it was the Kurds. And the Kurds so happened to be secular, democratic. They had progressive values, which in a region that is so conservative were incredibly refreshing. And one thing that I've always argued is that the American and British mistakes of the past have always been sort of top-down peace building, whereby they sort of create institutions, they invade countries and think that they can impose their version of democracy on the peoples of different regions, whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq. What is essential for the future of Western civilization, how it engages with regions, particularly as those regions continue to change through climate, because of the effects of climate change, because of the ongoing social and economic problems. It's absolutely essential that we actually start doing bottom-up peace building, whereby we listen to what local views are and we support them. And in Syria, we did an amazing job. We supported the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, in defeating the Islamic State. And I saw a lot of those same tactics used in Ukraine, where the Ukrainian people rose up, hundreds of thousands, just like the beginning of the First World War and the Second World War. Yeah. When young men went to the recruitment stations, I saw the same thing in Kyiv and in Lviv and many other places. And the Brits and the Americans did a really good job of supplying crucial equipment when needed at certain timely fashions. in other places, they made terrible mistakes. That's another issue. But I think internationalism still lives, and that's something I've tried to push.
Yeah, and I want to ask you a bit more about, partly yourself, but also you're not the only international volunteer, not even the only one who's fought in both Syria and Ukraine. Aidan Aslin, for instance, comes to mind. What drives people like you? What kind of other people do you meet who are in a similar kind of boat? What is it about?
What makes up an international volunteer? Well, to be polite, it's a broad church. So, and to answer you both, I've got sort of an academic interest in the phenomenon that is the international volunteers, and the role of hybrid warfare in a very changing and evolving international landscape. But in regards to, if we put aside Syria for a second and look uniquely at Ukraine, Zelensky did a bold thing by calling for international support and calling for international volunteers to join a so-called Ukrainian Legion or International Legion in Ukraine. But from the get-go, I knew it was going to have issues and problems. And as you can imagine, if you do a call out on the internet, all kinds of people are going to turn up. So something like 20,000 people turned up in the first year alone. A lot of those people did filter out. And what you see now, 3 years into the war, is a very competent mix of very professional people, whether it's drone teams, whether it's people on the front line or trainers or whatever, supporting the Ukrainian military. But over the last couple of years, you have seen the clowns, the fools, and the dreamers all turning up. So it is a very strange mix of people that have gone to Ukraine to support them. But one thing I do want to say is when you look at the scheme as a whole, largely speaking, I think it's done more good than bad.
Yeah, and is it people who necessarily have combat backgrounds or a mixture? Did you have a combat background before?
Apart from Syria,
before you went to Syria, had you had any experience?
No, not really. I mean, I joined the territorial army for a very brief period of time. In fact, incredibly brief when I was in London working. But for me, when I went to Syria, it was all about actually fighting is the least I do. Fighting is actually not even how I define myself, because in Syria, you saw the rise of the Islamic State butchering the people of Syria and Iraq. And we had no idea in 2014 whether or not the Islamic State would spread to Lebanon, whether it would spread to Jordan or to Turkey. And the sort of odious insidious grip of fundamentalism was spreading. And the Islamic State was incredibly sophisticated at the propaganda that they pushed out to the world. Everyone remembers Jihadi John and everything else. For me, as someone who is an internationalist, someone who truly believes in individual liberty, democracy, and secularism, I found, as I said, the local forces on the ground that Britain and America could support and should support, and weren't obviously listed as a terror group or anything like that. Yeah. I abided by British law in that respect. And I went out and I supported them. As I said, fighting was the least I did. Because as far as I was concerned, fighting is the sort of ultimate act of solidarity with someone else. If someone is under threat or their house is being ripped apart and people are being murdered, you can send all the love and best wishes in the world, or you could deal with the effects of the crisis by raising funds or sending food or whatever. Or you could actually go and live by your ideals and support people on the ground that need your help. And that philosophy very much informed my time in Ukraine as well. At the end of the day, Ukraine, regardless of which side you sit on this conflict, Ukraine is a sovereign country. It's on the edge of Europe. It ranks higher than Russia in the democratic freedom indexes. It is a country that does not want to be invaded and see its cities razed to the ground. And from that perspective alone, standing alongside them and fighting and serving with them is as I said, the ultimate act of solidarity. One thing I do want to say is where I see myself is see myself as a soldier last, is that one thing I've always tried to do is communicate the local cause to a wide international audience, because in a time of a lot of disinformation, a time of confusion, a time where the West is suffering from war fatigue, it's suffering from democracy fatigue, or certain element. We've in the last few years we've had a terrible so-called culture war where societies have become so polarized and so divided that even the very foundations of the country are called into question by people. And in that place, in that time of crisis, there are bad actors who are going to try and infiltrate and spread disinformation. And as I said, as someone who believes in freedom and democracy, as someone who is a human rights activist, I think it's my goal also to speak up, and that is where I see myself.
And sticking with the sort of kind of people you meet on the international brigades, I mean, the principle is clearly a defining thing. Is there also an element of, I guess, I don't know, a bit of some element of adventurism? I mean, it is exciting. And
principlism is an element. It is not the defining element. When I wrote Fighting Evil, the account of my time fighting in Syria, I made an effort. Obviously, I didn't have a huge say on what went into that book. I think the publishers had a vision, I had a vision, and we made a compromise. And where I put my foot down was I tried to tell people that you cannot look at international volunteers like myself as all good or all bad, because everyone has their own motivation for involving themselves in a foreign conflict or going abroad. And as I said, I was being diplomatic when I said there's a broad church of people there. So it's because you can imagine, as I said before, if you do a call for people all around the world to go to a conflict zone to fight for freedom and democracy, you can imagine what kind of people turn up. And that those are people who either are hopeless cases where they've got nothing going on at home. They're people who might have some deficiencies within their own life. They might be searching for a sense of completion that the West doesn't give them. Yet at the same time, they might also be motivated by either their faith, their personal faith to them, or they might be motivated by that democracy and freedoms that you mentioned. Or they could be a mixture of all of those things. So it is so difficult to define. All you can do is actually just look at them as individuals and judge them that way. As I said, you can judge the international volunteers as a whole as well to see how they've done over the last few years. And on balance, I think they've done a good job in many areas. So, yeah. And
it seems to come in a great tradition going back to at least, the international brigades fighting Franco in Spain. That's immediately what comes to mind. It's the modern version of that.
Yeah, it's an extension of it. I mean, all throughout history, people have been motivated to go abroad and support causes that mean a lot to them, whether it's fighting against fascism in Spain, whether it's the American Eagles coming over to Britain and joining the RAF to fight against Nazism in Europe. It goes back to literally a millennium. It's just that in recent times, because of the advance of social media, because of improvements in the people's ability to fundraise, to acquire monies to travel, I think it's going to become even more of a thing in the future, particularly as the world goes through changes. I genuinely think that we've entered a new Cold War. Cold War II has already begun. And the rise of the Wagner Group, or the Wagner Group in Russia, and the use of mercenaries abroad, and as I said, part of hybrid warfare, the use of proxies to fight allied states of other nations. Russia is heavily involved, and I do think internationalism is an extension of that, or it's a subcategory of that, but it would be a mistake to think that the international volunteers are driven by some other state and used as a proxy. That I'm not saying that, but it is part of the same phenomenon. Yeah, it's international volunteers are, as I said, and it's an expression of human energy. It's in the modern world where people are free to travel and can go abroad if they so wish. It's a form of humanism and humanitarianism that is quite unique, but a growing interest. It's interesting.
And I want to return to Ukraine for a moment. I mean, there's a lot of talk now about the war coming to a close on all sides. Zelensky talks about his victory plan for next year. But equally, the bigger thing people are talking about is Donald Trump saying, I'm going to end the war on day one of him coming into office. There will be an end to the war. Of course, there will be. What does a good settlement for Ukraine look like to you?
Well, there's many different outcomes that could happen. The one that I would love to see, which is possible to happen, but not necessarily likely to happen, and that is just simply a return to the 2022 borders, whereby there is a section of the Donbass still controlled by Russia. There's the Crimea still controlled by Russia. Even this, I'd be criticized for saying. That would actually be a victory. By the way, a victory already has been achieved. Russia wanted all of Ukraine. Let's be absolutely clear about this. And there is actually a much wider geopolitical issue here that I will come onto in a second. But had Putin been successful and had taken Ukraine in 3 days, like he genuinely thought he would have taken Ukraine, and I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that he would have taken the Transnistria as well from Moldova. Moldova being the poorest country in Europe, a country outside of the EU, outside of NATO, a country that recently had an election and is part of the Russia's near abroad and its attempts to influence. They would have 100% taken Transnistria, and they would have taken all of Ukraine. Belarus already is although technically independent, is very much part of Russia. Kaliningrad is part of Russia. The next step could well have been the Balkans. Because and you might turn around and say, oh, Christ, they're in NATO. But Vladimir Putin is a bold man, is someone who genuinely believes that if he takes ground and holds it and hides behind his nuclear weapons, he can influence the West. That's why the Baltic defense plan has utterly changed, by the way. NATO has changed the defense of the Baltics, whereby before it was to cede ground for time, to stop the Russians, delay them as much as possible until NATO reinforcements come. Now it's not one step back, effectively, primarily because they know that the Russians, once they get their boots on the ground, it's going to be bloody difficult to get rid of them. But in a much broader sense, and this is something that some people really need to understand, Donald Trump needs to understand, and that is this is part of a much wider conflict. We are, Russia talks all the time about what's the word? Sort of regionalism, that the day of America being the global superpower is over, and that what he would like to see, Vladimir Putin, is a sort of a Russia world of Eastern European and Russia and the central regions of in Central Asia, and obviously a Chinese world as well, dominating the South China Sea. And I genuinely believe that there is a coordinated sort of plan to erode American, British, Western influences around the world, to erode our democracies and to threaten our interests everywhere. So there should be no part of this world that is not a front line we're willing to stand on and to counter, because this absurd idea that it is China that's the problem and that we should give up Ukraine to Russia to somehow take resources and put them towards China is mad. They're all linked, they're all together, and we should be prepared to fight this global war that is upon us.
And for the Ukrainians themselves, I mean, they, as you said, they've already won a partial victory. I mean, would you say that it's transformed how they see themselves? Is it something they can be proud of? What's your sense of
Absolutely. That? I mean, there was a burst of energy. Well, in the first month of the war, when the Russians were utterly annihilated, particularly north of Kyiv, and they saw very limited gains almost everywhere, actually. Even in Mariupol, where the Azov defenders were surrounded, that delayed them for just long enough for other resources to be put together and everything else. So, and also, NATO have been delighted that Russia is no longer the threat it once was. Russia's vast reserves of military equipment have also been annihilated in this war. And the more cynical people would obviously say that, oh, this is why it's been extended and this is why they support Ukraine and all the rest of it. And although there's an element of truth in them rubbing their hands together at how fantastic it is to see Russia diminished, it doesn't change the basic facts of what's happening on the ground. And as you say, the early successes brought Ukraine time. It bolstered a sense of national identity, and it also, very crucially, got the international community united around Ukraine, because the Americans and the Brits were literally saying to Zelensky in the early days of the war, "We will give you a ride. We'll get you out of there if you need it." Perhaps what they were thinking is the best we can hope for is to fund some sort of insurgency in Ukraine and try and kill as many Russian soldiers as humanly possible and drive them out over a long period of time through similar tactics that the Taliban did to the United States. Instead, they were utterly blown away that the Ukrainian military, which is a tenth of the Russian military, actually did a marvelous and amazing job of taking the blows and then actually counterattacking in places like Kharkiv and in Kherson, the place where I fought. And now we've reached this sort of stalemate where the Ukrainians have risen up to defend themselves. The Russians have been diminished, and now they're sort of broadly equal. And now the Russians' only plan is to throw as many troops on the front line as humanly possible in these dreadful meat waves, dying in tremendous numbers. So the drone team I put together, we were targeting everything. To begin with, it was only because the shortage of drones were blowing up armored vehicles and tanks, oftentimes wiping out entire convoys of Russian vehicles. And then when the sort of Ukrainian cottage industry of drones really emerged, we then began targeting literally individual soldiers with drones, often several drones at a time, which obviously is an expense of several thousand US if you look at it from a commercial perspective. But what it's caused is the Russians to lose vital assets, the ability to do combined warfare and to make decent substantial advances, and it's buying Ukraine time. So we'll have to see what happens next.
Macer, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.